can't tell you, these are your feelings, these are the ones that you should pay attention to or not. This is how much self-discipline you have and how you can develop it. That really can only be accomplished by trial and error along the way. And because Mill cares so much about eudaimonia, about full human flourishing, he has to care about those inner states and not just the external stuff we can see you doing. Your ability to choose in a way that is your own choice is critically important for your becoming whoever it is you will end up becoming. And fourth, most of the reasons that we've been giving so far are about your moving toward your own happiness. Mill thinks, as a utilitarian, greatest happiness for the greatest number of people, that your choosing ought also to be considered in light of what it does for other people. The more free you are to move toward your own life plan externally and your internal way of getting there, the better it is for everybody else in society. And Mill thinks that that's true for two reasons. One, he thinks conformism is deadly. He thinks conformity just keeps us all locked in a trap where we don't think for ourselves, we don't develop in our own way. And so the more you are willing to break out of conformity and be a little bit eccentric, the more conformity gets loosened up, the more there is just a broad state of freedom that everybody can benefit from. And the second way in which your choices can help others, you might actually try some specific thing that I decide looks pretty good for me too. Maybe it wouldn't have occurred to me to do this specific thing with my life that you have worked out for yourself, but I saw you doing it and I thought, whoa, what a cool idea, I am going to try that out now. And that might end up actually being valuable for me. So we need freedom. We also need variety of situations, Mill says. We need specific opportunities to exercise that freedom. It wouldn't be any good for somebody to lock me in a box and say, you're free, I'll come back in 20 years, enjoy your freedom. There actually has to be a free social playing field on which I can live out that freedom. So chapter 4 now has had the ground prepared for it. We understand more fully why people should be free to speak and to act short of harming one another. And we get a more updated version of the harm principle here that says don't violate other people's rights. It also says contribute to your society. That is, except for a couple of hints in chapter 1, a new thing that Mill has added here in the 4th chapter. I have to, he says, bear my fair share of society's costs and labors. What does he mean? He means, yeah, it is a great thing to have a police and a sewer system. Somebody's got to pay for it. Somebody has to actually make the police department run, the sewer system function. You can't be a complete freeloader, or in a weird roundabout way you are harming other people. Those things take money. Those things take maybe even person power. You need to contribute. Again, he puts things in an abstract way. We don't know exactly what he means. These are just kind of guesses that probably he was talking about things like roads, taxes for roads. But he does mean that we have to somehow actively contribute to society's needs. And if we violate other people's rights but fall short of harming them in a legal way, we may harden them still in a social way, and then it's time for people to come in and make clear socially that they no longer care to do anything with us. I've got 5 minutes left, and what I'm going to do is to talk about the objections that Mill raises against himself in chapter 4. He's a careful philosopher. He knows that there might be problems with his viewpoint that readers will be concerned about. He wants to beat them to the punch and say, these are the difficulties, I think I can solve them. The first difficulty that Mill raises is a biggie. If Mill cannot save himself from this objection, he's shot. There's just no hope for him. So he has to have a good solution to it, and of course that's why it's also important for him to raise it. The first objection is, here I am in the harm principle saying, I can do whatever I want to myself as long as I don't harm you, even if I'm harming myself. What about the fact that we are so socially connected? If I harm myself, I'm probably causing you some kind of damage. You might depend on me to do something that I'm not able to do because I'm lying drunk in the gutter. You might depend on me more loosely to cast an intelligent vote. I didn't bother to pay attention to the newspapers or read anything about the candidates. so I'm going to cast a stupid vote. You're a little harmed by that. How are we ever going to get self-harm and other harm separate from one another? Mill has an answer to that, and it introduces a somewhat new concept. It's a very important concept and maybe ought to have even been part of the updated harm principle in Chapter 4. And essentially it is, because here he is telling us about it in Chapter 4. And that is, I don't have a right to violate a, and this is a technical term, distinct and assignable obligation to anyone else. I don't have a right to violate an obligation, something that I am supposed to do for someone else that they have a right to expect from me. Philosophers say generally that rights and obligations match with one another. So if I have an obligation to do something for you, you have a right to expect it from me. It needs to be a distinct obligation. Not some kind of vague, fuzzy thing like, oh, I have to make you as happy as you can possibly be. That's a really big, weird burden to put on me. But I might have a distinct obligation to buy you lunch this afternoon. We know what that is. It's got boundaries on it. I buy you lunch, and then I'm done. An assignable obligation. Who do I have this obligation to? Well, apparently I just offered to buy you lunch. So it's an assignable obligation that I have to you. One example of a case where we might say there's a distinct and assignable obligation, if I bring a child into the world, I have signed on to take care of that human being. I have to feed it, I have to shelter it, I have to provide it with clothing, I have to refrain from physically abusing it, I have to try to provide it with some kind of education. That's part of what we understand a parent's obligation to be. It's a distinct obligation for the most part. These are the things you're supposed to do. And it sure as heck is assignable. I'm not worried about somebody else's kid down the street nearly so much as I am the actual child I produced. So, if I harm myself in a way that prevents me from carrying out my distinct and assignable obligation, I'm drunk when I ought to be feeding my kid and my kid goes hungry, that's not good. But if I send the child off to daycare and drink 18 beers, perfectly fine. I'm harming myself, my liver won't be happy, but I haven't violated my obligation to my child. I've made sure that my child's obligations are taken care of. So self-harm is only a problem when it violates a distinct and assignable obligation. Very quickly, the second objection is that I might harm somebody else by my example. And Mill says, as long as we're talking about another adult, that person has the rational capacity to think for themselves in response to what your example shows. If your example is really a bad one, let's leave that person free to reason about the bad stuff they just saw you doing and decide whether they want to follow that example. And third, if people harm themselves, haven't they just shown that they're like 5-year-olds? Haven't they just shown that they can't think for themselves? Maybe I ought to step in and control their behavior paternalistically after all. Mill says the odds are, if I start allowing myself to control the behavior of 40-year-olds who harm themselves, I'm going to end up causing rebellion. I'm going to end up controlling people in a way that prevents them from developing themselves. I'm going to cause a far worse mess than the one I would have had if I just left you free to harm yourself. So ultimately, this is a text that is trying to delineate the proper boundaries between paternalism, authority on the one hand, freedom, liberty, and self-development on the other hand, and it is pointed toward the idea that unless I'm really hurting you, no one else but me has a right to decide how to control my life. And that is a modern point of view. Thank you.